Hello, my name is Larissa, and I would like to talk about one of Einstein's favorite authors, Spinoza. Einstein said that he only believed in the God of Spinoza. And he also wrote a love poem to Spinoza, which, Einstein is not really like a poet. At least he's not known for that. So it's a very special thing. And I would like to explain why I think Einstein was so much in love with Spinoza. Spinoza is a great, great thinker. And but I would like to share a couple of things that inspired Einstein from Spinoza. But before I do that, I would like to explain a couple of things about Spinoza. So I went on this quest to try to understand Spinoza. And then trying to understand Spinoza also implies trying to understand a lot of different authors. Because, of course, Spinoza is very unique in his way of thinking. But a man is not an island unto himself. We always feed off of our predecessors. So Spinoza has he was very well read, of course, and he was inspired by different authors, whether because he rejected those authors or because he took some of the things from them. But for the purposes of this Spinoza-Einstein connection, I would like to explain what I found that are two very important influences in Spinoza's thought that then influenced Einstein. So I would call Spinoza a Cartesian Kabbalist, even though but some people may disagree, but let me explain why. So let's start with Kabbalah first, and why I think there's an elements of that. Actually, there's one element. First of all, Spinoza said about Kabbalists, what he said was, I've read some of those Kabbalists and I'm not sufficiently amazed with them. So he didn't agree. But Kabbalah has many different things. Kabbalah has gematria, which is the interpretation of the numeric value of the letters. Kabbalah has the tree of life. Kabbalah has the origin of the universe, the Tzimtzum Aleph and the Tzimtzum Bet. There's many, many different things. But there's one thing that both Spinoza and Maimonides, that they both agreed upon, is a non-corporeal God. And Spinoza, when he talked about God, he referred to God as an infinite substance. And in Kabbalah, that comes from, in Kabbalah, God is not corporeal, they call it the Ein Sof, which literally means without end, which is the infinite. It's an infinite, which has no beginning, no end, no space, no time. It's just an infinite ocean. It eludes all concept. And so that's the concept of Kabbalah that then Maimonides took and that Spinoza agreed upon, which he was very particular with the things that he subscribed to, the ideas. So the Ein Sof, he didn't call it the Ein Sof, but he called it the infinite, which is Ein Sof, So that's the one thing that we can, sort of capture from the Kabbalists, the Ein Sof, that concept. So regarding the Cartesian element, because I said Cartesian Kabbalist, the Cartesian element, so Descartes, it comes from Descartes, of course. So Descartes, when on this quest to try to find out, it's a branch of philosophy called epistemology, to try to find out what do we know? How do we know what we know? How do we know that we actually know? Those kinds of questions is what epistemology asks. And so he went on this quest and he realized that he was like trying to question. How do we know that this is a table? How do we know that's a famous thing, table and a chair? And how do we know that this is this or that? And then he was questioning, like, oh, we could be dreaming. How do we know we're not dreaming? Because when we dream, we experience things similarly. And so he arrived at this essential conclusion, which is his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. The fact that I think means I exist, basically. And so that's sort of like, it's the foundation, it's sort of like the essence of his thinking. But apart from that, Descartes also wrote about that this universe is composed of one main substance, which is God, and then that substance, Descartes said, had two substances, which are thought, the substance of thought, and the substance of extension, which are basically corporeal matters. So thought and corporeal matters. So one substance that has two substances, okay? So it's an analogy, not saying that's how it is, but it is as if Descartes was sort of like an architect or a contractor, and Spinoza went into this palace that Descartes built, or, like a cathedral or something. And he said, I like the materials, I like the pillars, I like sort of like the foundational elements, but I want to rearrange it. And that rearrangement that Spinoza made was very important. It seems like they're similar, but they're not. So Spinoza's sort of adjustment, so like a chiropractic adjustment to Descartes' ideas, was that he said, no, there's no 2, 3 substances. There's one, the infinite, which is the Ein Sof, the infinite substance, God. That's the only substance. And then from that substance, Spinoza wrote, there are infinite attributes. But of those infinite attributes, we humans, with our little brains and our little existence, we can only pick up or perceive 2 of those attributes, which are what for Descartes were the 2 substances, but for Spinoza are the attributes and are the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension. So thought and extension. For Descartes, those were the 2 substances that derived from the main substance. So that's the main adjustment that Spinoza made to Descartes' cathedral of thought. And then he said, but remember, he said, this infinite substance has infinite attributes. We're just too limited in our ability to perceive, and so we just perceive these 2. And then he said that those 2 attributes have infinite modes of existence. So the attribute of thought has infinite modes, and the attribute of extension has infinite modes, one being bodies, corporeal matters, stars, planets, our physical body, everything. And then the thought, our thoughts, the mind of, and the consciousness behind things. So that's, those are the main 2 things from Descartes. So now we're gonna mix them together like if we were cooking a meal. And so to make the connection that I found between Spinoza and Einstein, and then with these 2 basic influences, which is what I said, the Cartesian Kabbalist influence in Spinoza, and how sort of like those 2 tributary rivers influenced Spinoza and then influenced Einstein. And so we all know the famous Einstein, his formula, which is E equals mc squared, right? E equals m, which is matter, times the speed of light squared. So here's the thing. What Spinoza said was there is one substance, which is the infinite substance that I told you that the Kabbalists spoke about it, which is they named it the Ein Sof. And then that substance has 2 attributes, has infinite attributes, but our little minds can only perceive 2, which are the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension. And extension are corporeal matters. So if we look at this formula, we can see the Cartesian Kabbalist theory that I have. So the E would be the Ein Sof. This is Ein Sof. This is the infinite source, which is God. Then this E, the Ein Sof, equals the two attributes, which are matter, the attribute of extension, and then the speed of light squared is the attribute of thought, would be the attribute of the intangible, the attribute of thought. And so that's how the formula I think, that's my theory, that is how Spinoza inspired Einstein, the most direct connection I could make. Ta-da! But then I'm going to add something else. So I already explained the connection that I see, that it wasn't just that Einstein loved Spinoza, so much so that he wrote a love poem for Spinoza, saying, how much do I love this man? And he goes on to rhapsodize about Spinoza, and then says he will remain with a holy halo of his own, and just loved him. But in my theory, it's not just an ethereal love. I see a palpable and tangible proof of Einstein's love and of Spinoza's influence in like how he left an imprint in Einstein's mind and soul, so that his theory is sort of like it's very similar. It's like it has that same structure of Spinoza's thought. And so I read Ethics, one of Spinoza's books, and in that book there is something else. So this is my contribution and like just something else I found. In this book, Spinoza talks about this structure, the infinite, which is God, and then he talks about extension, the attribute of extension, and he explains, with very specific propositions, like according to the geometrical order, meaning like he uses the principles of geometry to explain in a very well-structured manner, okay? So he explains extension. Then he goes on, so first he explains the infinite, then he explains the attribute of extension in detail. Then he explains the attribute of thought in detail, which is what he said, an infinite substance that has infinite attributes, out of which two are available to our senses, which are thought and extension, right? He explains that. But he devotes a good portion of that book to talk about the affects, which are the emotions, all our emotions. And he calls it like something that is it's a struggle for the human existence. How do we deal with these forces that really sometimes make us do things and that we don't want to do? And he says that we are sometimes, those affects enslave us to behaviors that we don't want to engage in. Of course, he didn't have all the names that we have today, which could be in the category of affects. It could be compulsions, addictions, obsessions, all the different the words that we have today, he didn't have back then. But he goes on to talk, he talks a lot about it. And he makes a very clear distinction between the infinite, extension, thought, and then he devotes a good portion, but he doesn't mention it as an attribute. He doesn't say, okay, there is this infinite substance and it has three attributes available to us. He said only two, okay, which is what I saw the connection with Einstein's theory. And so this is my theory, that this is the third attribute. The third attribute is the attribute of emotion, of affect. affect, what he calls affect. Then he says something very important that I would like just to share here. It's that he says, and this is what inspired Freud. He said, because everything that happens to everything that we experience comes from the infinite, it comes from God, but we don't understand it. And he says, if we were able to understand the etiology, the origin, the cause of these affects, even the ones that cause us suffering, if we were able to understand their causes, we would no longer feel pain. They would be a source of joy or fulfillment because they all come from the divine, from the infinite. But so I think my theory is the theory of the third attribute that Spinoza talked so much about, but he didn't describe it as an attribute in itself. And it perfectly matches with the theory of it's not even a theory, it's proved, the theory of the triune brain. So it's sort of like if, our brain, it has the reptilian, the basic brain, then it has the emotional brain that has organs, and then it has the neocortex. So it's sort of like we have sort of like an antenna to perceive 3 of the infinite attributes of God. And Spinoza talked about extension, which would be, with our physical body. It's our physical body, but we also perceive physical objects through our physical bodies, right? So that would be one way in which sort of like this antenna that our brain can pick up on these attributes. One of the attribute of extension. Then with the neocortex and all the higher functioning, we pick up on the attribute of thought, or we express the attribute of thought. But then in the middle, we have the emotions, and those are the affects. So that's the third attribute. And that's my theory about that. I think that's a little piece that, even though he wrote a lot about it, he didn't describe it as an attribute. And so, yeah, that's my theory. The third attribute that Spinoza missed, and I think this is my theory, that he missed, and it's part of our ability to perceive the infinite, which is God. And so, if my premises are correct, which they are, that Einstein was inspired by Spinoza in his famous formula E equals mc squared, and if there is a third attribute, such a thing as a third attribute, which there is, and then there's something else. In his book, in Ethics, Spinoza talked a lot about the fact that we humans, we have a lot of inadequate ideas, and that we need to search for the adequate ideas. And the more we connect with the infinite, which he calls God, the more we connect with that, the more we sort of purify our minds, and the more we reach the adequate ideas. But with the third attribute, which is the attribute of affects, there are many affects, but we don't have to wonder what is the adequate affect, because we already know what the adequate affect is. The adequate affect is love. So with the affects, we don't have to guess. With thought, And so, if all those premises are correct, then I'm going to be so courageous as to adding something to Einstein's formula. So we have E, which if we establish the parallel with Spinoza, this would be the infinite substance, which would be the Ein Sof, E. Then M would be the attribute of extension or corporeal matter. Then C squared would be thought, the consciousness. Consciousness. And then we would have to add the third attribute. And since we already know what is the adequate affect, then Now Einstein's formula would look something like this. E equals mc squared times love. So that substance that the scientists are trying to figure out, where are the planets floating? What is all that substance? It's love. That would explain everything. Love, that is the essence, and that is what sustains our universe, the force of love. Thank you so much for watching.